Welcome, everyone. We're at Black Hat in 2019. I get the year right. That's good. That's good. We've been to Black Hat in many conferences and have done these interviews. This is the first time we've got like some major recording going on, lots of interviews to do, all of which I'm very excited about, especially core security. Steve, oh, how do you say your last name, Steve?
Laubenstein.
Steve Laubenstein. He's the
Yes.
VP of Cyber Threat Products Group at Core Security. Now, Core Security has, of course, merged or been acquired by Help Systems, but you're maintaining the Core Security brand.
Yes.
Core Security goes way back to the very beginning of Security Weekly. Myself and several of the other hosts were using Core Impact in a lot of penetration tests and communicating what we loved about it, which was a lot, actually, to our audience. And so it's nice to come full circle and have you back today and talk about the things that are happening at Core Security.
Well, it's wonderful to be here and actually to meet you. I've heard about you over the years through the company.
Yeah,
and,
awesome.
First time we've actually had a chance to sit down and chat.
Yeah, it's great. So now Core Security today still does penetration testing as a service. You still have the Core Impact product, the
Yes.
penetration testing product. You also do some advanced threat detection, which was added in, which I like. I think it's a nice complement to understanding the latest threats and, of course, probably applying those to your testing, right?
Yes. The product that you're referring to there is a product called Network Insight.
Yep.
And what it does, it identifies devices that have been compromised with certainty. And we're doing this through a variety of ways, but basically we're taking multiple pieces of evidence and able to convict a device that it's been compromised.
So you're automating the threat hunt, essentially, with that product.
Yes, in some senses.
I like it.
We do a lot on the carrier backbones, and to your point of how this all comes together, a lot of the threat research and information we're getting off the carrier backbones from our enterprise customers on that side is coming together with our exploit teams and our people who do the pen testing and really helping build stuff that's more adversarial specific and things of that nature.
So what's the primary problem you're solving today when you go to a customer? Like, what problems they bring into you?
Yeah, it's all about risk. I mean,
Yeah.
it's like there's not a new, unique problem to go solve per se in this area. It's really trying to identify, quantify, and prioritize what do we need to work on.
Yeah, it's like a picture of their security posture, basically, with the risk equation thrown in there.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And as we were chatting earlier, you have some pen testing in your background.
Yep. Absolutely.
It's one of the few ways you can definitively define, is this a risk or not?
Right.
Theoretically, it might look like it is on paper, but until you actually go test and find out, it's hard to know. And just like any pro football team, you put them on a field, they look great on paper until they actually go play games.
Yes.
Then you find the
Yes.
weaknesses. And that's
And
what pen testing's about.
That human component is still very, very important because we can automate as much as we want, but until you put a human and say, test my defenses, I don't think you've really truly tested your defenses. And the difference between an attacker and a pen tester is with a pen tester, you get the results. An attacker is not going to give you, their findings,
Exactly.
right? So.
And I really like the fact you use the word human. So many people think, oh, hey, you just run this tool and it's going to come back and it's going to spit out all this stuff for you. That's not true. It's a tool to be used by pen testers.
Right.
That'll make them a lot more efficient and provide them a lot more capabilities, but it still needs that human interaction.
Yeah, and there's so much automation and technology today in cybersecurity, right? But what I come down to in my career, I've been at organizations as the defender, and the organization will say, I'll say, like, this piece is vulnerable, and I think it needs to be addressed. And, oh, no one can do anything with that. That's not a risk, right? And we accept that risk when they really don't know what the risk is until a human comes along, uses that vulnerability or exposure in their attack, and see where it leads, that the organization can come back and truly assess risk.
Yeah.
So I think it's very important today to have that.
Yeah, absolutely.
How does it integrate with vulnerability management? How do you see pen testing today integrating with vulnerability management programs?
Vuln programs, obviously kick out thousands upon thousands of vulnerabilities. And the manufacturers are getting good at trying to prioritize from a risk perspective, et cetera. Hey, we think this is most critical, et cetera. What the real missing element in many of these programs is what compensating controls are actually in place.
Yep.
I might have a vuln that's really super critical, but if it's on a server and I got to get hands on a keyboard and that's behind a retina scanner and there's two guys in that room, is that really that critical?
Right.
And there's others that may not be as critical, but they really expose, and provide access and provide a pivot point to get to much
It's that chaining. I don't believe today we have the software that can make those decisions about if I take this exposure here, that exposure there, and maybe even not even a vulnerability, but some other configuration that you're not accounting for. Individually, you may look at those as the IT administrator or CISO and go, not a big deal.
Right.
When the pen tester comes along and you start chaining those things together, now you have a much better picture of risk, essentially.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there's a very famous breach, a few years back through a heating and air conditioning computer system.
Right.
Probably not the highest priority from an IT perspective, but know what happened there.
Right.
The other key thing with the VM programs too is that it really helps you understand the compensating control really effective.
Yes.
We had a customer.
That's a great point.
We had a customer that had applied the latest patch. The vuln scanner came back, said latest patch is there, and they actually had that compromised a few weeks later. Fortunately, it was by a pen tester, and not an external adversary. But what had happened was the guy never rebooted the server.
It's so common. You either didn't reboot, or there's 2 copies of the DLL on the Windows system.
Yeah.
And the vuln scanner goes, yep, you're good, you're patched, but there's another copy of the vulnerable library or software on that system, right? I used to work at Tenable, so I understand all those conditions very, very well.
You know, and that's just where that human element and the testing comes back in. It looks great, but let's make sure.
Yeah, agreed. Now, I really am excited to talk about the different types of penetration tests, also the different goals and outcomes that you should have for pen tests, because I believe this has really greatly evolved, like from way back in the day where it was a red team assessment, you give us your external IP, and our goal is to break in, right?
Yeah.
And that's what pen testing was. I love the evolution of it, because I think there's so many different areas that we can test as part of a penetration test. The first area that I had was really response and processes, right? I mean, it's great if I can break into a system, but for me, as the pen tester, not so great for the organization, right? And maybe I escalate and I get data, and that's a finding. But it can also test those the response and the processes that did you detect that someone got in, right? Do you find that some of your tests you're doing more testing the processes and the response more so than the actual vulnerabilities and exposures?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, kind of what you're describing is what some people call red-blue teaming, where the blue team is kind of people responsible for identifying that there is an attack and how do they respond and react. And what we're seeing from a lot of organizations these days is more purple teaming.
Yes, exactly.
And the
working together.
Exactly. The analogy I would use is, you run a football play and I burn you on a screen, you say, well, I was looking for a deep pass. Well, if I tell you I'm going to run a screen and you can't defend it, I know a lot more now, don't I?
Yes.
And we're seeing more organizations declaring, hey, we're going to do some SQL testing. Let's see how, number one, you can, identify what we're doing, and number two, how you do react.
Right. That's so important,
Yes.
to testing the entire process, not just whether or not a control is in place or not.
Right.
Which is great. And, I think for me, I've kind of broken out with purple teaming, right? I think you need make sure you incorporate all those different groups, right? So you have maybe the red team, maybe they're internal or external. You've got the security team, and then you've got the sysadmins, and then you've got the network admin, and that's all part of your blue team. So I like to make sure organizations test all those different components, not just can the SOC detect that something happened.
Right.
How does that escalate down to the sysadmin, who may also need to rely on the network admin or the cloud admin to go deploy new infrastructure, right? So your blue team is really everyone in your organization.
Yeah, response time is very important. I mean, to your point, if this is a process that takes weeks, time is your enemy. I mean, if you really have somebody that, comes into your environment, to be able to stop it as soon as possible is important. So having a good chain and understanding response and how people react is very important.
Because someone's always going to be able to get in, right? I mean, let's be frank. There's always going to be, like you mentioned the user before, some user's going to click something, right?
Yeah.
But if you can spot that as quickly as possible, I think that's really what security comes down to, right? As quickly as possible response.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think we're pretty much in our industry now where people realize that we're not going to be able to stop everything. And the user is the big issue. I mean, I heard this anecdotally, maybe you know the source for it, but I heard roughly 75% of people will fall to a modern phishing attack where they're doing highly trained programs that can't get it below 15 or 20%.
Yeah.
And, so you're always going to have people clicking on links, giving up creds to a good fish on a social. Someone calls you up, says, hey, I need XYZ.
Right.
So there's always going to be exposures in organizations.
And I also think another aspect of pen testing is you test the process and the response, right? And you may test the vulnerabilities and exposures, but you also want to test the tools. Like you put these tools in place. You've got a SIM, you've got some endpoint protection. How do you know they're really working, right? And that's, I think, a different type of test than just trying to find vulnerabilities and exploiting them, or testing the process is, did my security tool discover the alert? Did it block when it was supposed to block?
Yeah.
Like, did it do all the things it was supposed to do? And that's a pen test gives you a great way to test that.
Yeah, there's a lot of different approaches to pen testing, as you know. I mean, I could drop an agent on a system, come in with PowerShell, and look like very normal traffic, and I might be very hard to detect. There's other things I can do that are a little more noisy, and depending on what I'm doing, really kind of affects my detectability per se. We run a testing suite of a lot of the endpoint agents and our own testing, to see how effective our exploits are in bypassing them. And it's the same thing organizations are doing as well. They want to replicate a lot of what we do in building our product in their organizations, just to see how effective some of those measures are.
And the response to that sometimes is you just need to configure your security tool differently or better. And sometimes the response is, well, that's never going to detect that. I need to rely on something else to detect it, right?
Yeah.
And so if you do both those things, you're in much better shape if this is an iterative process. Yeah. How often, Steve, do you think people should do the human-based pen test?
It really depends on your objectives in your organization, what you're doing. What we find is most of the pen testing teams that are employed within the organizations, they're doing it on a continuous basis. They're rolling out new apps. You definitely need to pen test them before you roll them out, especially web apps. I mean, if you're putting web apps out without doing a pretty extensive test of them first, that's just asking for trouble.
No matter how you automate that, develop our internal application, you can automate all the tests you want until the user hits it. They're just going to come up, whether it's a user or whether it's a pen tester, they just come up with scenarios that are very difficult to account for as a developer.
Yeah, exactly. And it also just helps give you some of that assurance that, hey, it does look like, we're in pretty decent shape. You're never obviously totally secure.
Right.
Infrastructure, any new infrastructure getting rolled out, et cetera, should be tested. We see a lot of audit teams coming back with the vuln programs. One of the major bank customers we have, the guy who runs audit for him, he's one of our biggest customers within the bank. He has multiple testers, and what they're doing is going back and making sure that the remediations and stuff that was supposed to be corrected and found was actually corrected.
Right.
So how often, I think, really comes back to what are you doing within your programs, et cetera.
And how mature your program is, right? I think not like early on the maturity curve, you're testing just to kind of get like a feel for what you have, what might be most vulnerable, right, to help prioritize. Then as you mature, like you said, Steve, as you build out new security infrastructure and applying security to it, I want to test that after it's been built, right?
Yep.
Early tests may go, this is what you need to build, right? Yeah. But you also need to test after you've built that to say, okay, does it really work?
And you're making a great point on that early testing. There are some organizations that shouldn't pen test.
Yeah, they should do a vuln scan first.
Exactly.
Right? Yeah.
Until you do some of the basic security things, you don't need a pen test to tell you, hey, you got this whole world of broke things.
Right.
Go put in some of the basic things first. But as you get more security mature, it does kick in. And I do think also it's important occasionally to get that third party to take a look as well. Most organizations, that have some very highly qualified people, including in our federal space as well, they're leveraging third parties to come in and just be a fresh set of eyes,
Absolutely.
Take a look.
Completely agree. Well, Steve, thank you so much.
Well, thank you. It's been a pleasure.